The gift of welcome from our Soul Matters small group programs. It seems to go without saying, to be welcoming, we've got to think big. Notice how often we speak about widening the circle and making more room. We place a priority on expanding our minds by welcoming new experiences and new ideas. Those that help usher in love are big-hearted. Those who help us welcome change are the ones with the big idea. Ask someone what image goes with welcoming, and they will surely say a person with open arms. So bigness, yes, let's definitely follow that road. But what about that smaller trail? The one that runs right alongside the wide road, the one harder to notice and certainly hard to travel, the one that whispers, don't forget the work of becoming smaller. We're learning that this path must be traversed as well. For instance, those of us who are white are realizing that to truly welcome diversity, we must shrink and decenter our voices. We long-timers are discovering that welcoming newcomers requires right-sizing our needs and putting our preferences second. The tree huggers have been telling us for years we can't save the wider world without shrinking our wants. The spiritual masters remind us that feeling at home in the universe demands that we see ourselves as a tiny part of a greater whole, rather than believing that the whole world revolves around us. The brilliant confess that their secret is the smallness of humility and the willingness to admit when they are wrong. And isn't it downsizing and living simply that allows us to welcome in more experience, adventure, and peace? Of course, there's always the work of downsizing our egos enough to admit mistakes. Without that, how can we ever welcome in forgiveness and the work of repair? Bottom line, there is a deep spiritual connection between the smallness of self and the expansiveness of relationship. It's a curious and wonderful truth. The road to a wider welcome often starts with limiting our own size. By becoming smaller, we paradoxically are better able to welcome in and receive the gift of more. So friends, as you journey, think big, but also stay small.
As Sheila mentioned, that's from our Soul Matters small group materials. We'll be having a Soul Matters small group for new members at the end of September. We have 1 or 2 spaces for older members if you'd like to join that group. It's good to have a mix of new and old members in those groups. And then we'll have in October another ongoing group that will be starting. As well as in October, we're going to be starting our UU Writers exploring the Soul Matters themes. So like Welcome for this month or Heritage in October through creative writing. So if you're interested in being a part of any of those groups, let me know and we'll get you signed up for them. So I titled this sermon, Never Ending Welcoming. And as the week wore on, I thought, I just wished I'd had a different title, I guess. Because while I want to convey that with that title, that this is an ongoing practice, that never-endingness started to feel a little bit like drudgery, right? Like, oh, we're going to have to do this practice over and over again. I don't want welcome to sound like a chore. Our Soul Matters resources for this month also include the etymology of that word welcome, which comes from the Old English, a compound word, a compounding of the words for pleasure and the word for guest. As a verb, that means that to welcome means to receive someone or something with pleasure. That's better, isn't it? Right? We don't want it to be drudgery. Welcoming should be a pleasure. The pleasure of welcoming another as a guest. what would it look like in your life to open up into the pleasure of welcoming? And this isn't just about welcoming newcomers in this congregation. I want you to ask yourself, what does it look like to see every person as a guest? To see every person with new eyes, even if you've been married to them for 51 years, even if you've been going to church with them for a decade or more, or even if they bring something to the table that you don't particularly like. Can you still open and welcome to them in pleasure? Can you still welcome that? Can you still welcome them? Some of you may have heard this example before because I give it often at meetings when I'm talking about welcoming newcomers. I suggest that if you're welcoming a newcomer, if you're talking to somebody and they say that they like Mozart and you don't like Mozart, that you don't respond by saying, I don't like Mozart. You respond by saying, tell me what it is that you love about Mozart. Tell me why you love Mozart. I usually say next that you could even say, I don't like Mozart, as long as you immediately follow that up with tell me why you love Mozart. Something like, I don't like Mozart, but tell me why you love Mozart, because I really want to know. I really want to know you, is what you're saying when you say that. And I actually don't like Mozart. Maybe that's why I use this example. So you're invited to come up to me after the service and tell me why you love Mozart, because I really do want to know about you and what Mozart brings to your life. I usually also follow this up by saying that I like Bach and Beethoven and Brahms, and I do like each of those classical composers. But I think the reason I follow up so quickly on my dislike of Mozart with examples of classical composers that I do enjoy is because I don't want to upset the UU establishment too much. So I want to invite us to widen the circle even beyond Bach and Brahms and Beethoven and Mozart. I want to invite us to widen the circle, taking our Soul Matters reading suggestion and make ourselves small by asking about the other person. And I want you to think about, what if the person loves Drake or Outkast or Outlandish or Public Enemy or the Wu-Tang Clan? I briefly considered changing the title to Welcoming Forever, in homage to the 1997 double album from the Wu-Tang Clan, Wu-Tang Forever, when I was worried it would sound like drudgery. But I must confess, I have not listened to that album very much. I love Wu-Tang's first album, Enter the 36 Chambers, which came out in '93. At age 17, I listened to Enter the 36 Chambers so many times I could still rap along 15 years later. I know that, you'll be surprised to hear, I know that because 15 years later, in my first course in UU seminary, we studied that Wu-Tang album from 1993. That's right, in UU seminary, we studied a Wu-Tang album. But I confess, even though I studied a hip-hop album in UU seminary, I was nervous to come up here, I'm nervous right now, about talking about rap music in a UU church. I feel pretty confident that some of you don't like rap music. That more than don't like it, some of you look down on it. That you might even make like one of those small, quick, ugly faces when someone brings it up. And that you may have been among those when rap was still young who said it didn't even qualify as music. And if you're honest with yourself, part of you still feels that way. So listen, that's actually okay. It's actually fine if you feel that way. Hip hop, rap music, doesn't care if you don't like it. It's been widely successful. It's doing okay. There are rappers across the globe rapping in Wolof and French in Senegal, rapping in Korean and K-pop hits, rapping in Urdu, in Spanish, in Danish. Rap is so successful that this week I listened to Terry Gross interviewing rappers. Some of you did too, right? Like Andre 3000 from Outkast and RZA from Wu-Tang Clan on Fresh Air. Because Fresh Air spent the week celebrating rap's 50th anniversary. But it's still okay if you don't like rap music, or even consider it music, for our purposes here today at least, as long as you do what I do with Mozart. As long as you don't make it about you. As long as you welcome the guest in with pleasure. As long as, if you feel the need to say, I do not like the Wu-Tang Clan, I do not like them, Sam I Am. In fact, I really don't get it. I don't get why people would like it, but tell me, please tell me. I really want to know, genuinely, what is it about Wu-Tang Clan that feeds your spirit? Now, I do love the Wu-Tang Clan and rap and hip-hop music in general, so if you don't, you're welcome to come ask me about that after the service. You can ask me, why don't you like Mozart, Rev Lev? And you can also ask me, why do you like Wu-Tang Clan? Side note, has anybody heard of the Mozart effect? Anybody? Yeah, so the Mozart effect was very popular, I don't know, 10, 20 years ago. There was a study, and then it was widely popularized, that if you listened to Mozart, it would make you more intelligent. There even was a series you could buy Mozart for babies. But guess what? Mozart, to my great joy, won't make you more intelligent. Listening to Mozart won't make you more intelligent. Fascinating thing, and to me this says a lot about, the only way I can make sense of this is the degree of Eurocentrism in our culture. The study actually said that all that listening to Mozart would do would help you perform slightly better on a test if you did it right before the test. And it wouldn't help me on that test, because actually what the study said is listening to any music you like before that test would help you do just a little bit better, right? So it could be Wu-Tang Clan, or Metallica, or Mozart, whatever you like. So we'll come back in a way to that in a second, but I just want to say that music makes a good illustrative example for a sermon on welcome, on inclusion, on diversity. But just as my talking about marriage a couple of Sundays ago wasn't about marriage, if you weren't here or you don't remember, it was about covenant. The point I'm trying to make today isn't really about music. You can still ask me about Mozart and or the Wu-Tang Clan after the service if you want. But this sermon isn't really about music. It's about welcoming. And this lesson about welcoming applies to just about anything. If a person believes in God and you don't, that's fine. You can even tell them you don't believe in God when they say they came here this morning in search of connection with God. But widen your circle and make yourself small and ask them about their belief in God, why they came here searching for it, what it does for their soul, their spirit, their heart and mind. Now, I could go on and on with example after example, and maybe I should, because that's the never-ending part. That's the practice part of welcoming. Practicing welcoming when you hear an idea about a different way of doing things in church, perhaps, and you think, wow, that's a dumb idea. Or we tried that before, and it didn't work. Everybody, I'm not talking about Accotink in specific, if you talk about churches, you hear people talk about having the experience in churches of bringing up a new idea and hearing people in churches say to them, oh, we tried that before, it didn't work. That's not welcoming, right? Can I get an amen? That's not welcoming. And it's not like the Mozart effect, it's not even true. If you tried it a decade ago and it didn't work, it might work now. It's a new context, new people, new culture. It might be there's a small tweak that makes all the difference. But even if it fails again, let's be welcoming and say, tell me, what is it about that idea that you're excited about? Maybe there's even an idea in the dumb idea. Maybe it really is a dumb idea. I mean, maybe. But maybe in that dumb idea, there's a brilliant kernel of an idea that only comes out if you're willing to welcome the idea and the person bringing the idea. Again, I could go on and on. We could try this about anything. Defund the police. You think it's a terrible idea? You think it's a great idea? Open your idea, your mind. I even did an exercise with the worship committee recently. We were talking about whether we would do the greet your neighbor section. Some people didn't like it. It gets really loud in here, disrupts the flow of service. Some people did like it. What we did is we had every person who didn't like it talk about what benefits there were to having that greet your neighbor. And every person who did like it talk about the negatives, the potential negatives. And after that, it almost didn't matter whether we kept greet your neighbor or not, right? We decided to keep it because it's so important to welcoming newcomers, by the way. It breaks the ice. I've gotten multiple feedback from newcomers that it helps them to not slink away at the end of the service in their shy moment of vulnerability, but to be more likely to stay. But the point is that we stepped into each other's shoes, right? We welcomed each other by exploring the other person's point of view. Okay, so I just want to also say that this welcoming happens even before we open our mouths, okay? It can happen when you see the car the person arrived in, and you might judge it. Your judgment clear to the driver in a glance. You might be judging because the car looks bad, like my car that has a long crack on the front windshield that's been there for months. You might judge me for that. Why doesn't he get that fixed? Though I really want to stress here, I'm not aware that anybody's been judging me for that. I haven't seen even an eyelash of judgment, okay? And if you are judging me, you've hit it well, and I appreciate it. But you could also just judge me because the car is a Prius. How pretentious. Okay. I'm probably not being judged at a UU church for driving a hybrid, but you never know. It could happen. Or maybe you see someone's car and you think that it's too fancy. You judge that person for their wealth or for showing off their wealth. Surveys of UU congregations actually show that a small number of UU congregants say that they are uncomfortable hiring a minister if that minister comes from money, comes from wealth. Didn't see that coming, did you? And in those surveys, UUs don't usually say they don't want a minister of a certain identity. Some of that is because we've done our work on our implicit bias. And some of that is because we just don't want to admit that bias, often not even to ourselves. That's not unique to Unitarian Universalists. That is why we humans study implicit bias, because people don't readily admit their biases and aren't even consciously aware of them, though they can still impact how we interact with others, including how welcoming we are. We see this in the surveys I mentioned about what identity UUs are comfortable with in a minister. These are usually done before calling a new minister during a search process, because in those surveys, we do share the identity of the ministers that we want the most, right? So we're not seeing a lot of no's, hard no's, but we do see what we're more comfortable with, right? It's like a Likert scale with like strongly uncomfortable, just slightly uncomfortable. And what we see, in case you're wondering, is that UUs are most comfortable, in their ministers at least, with white women, and then with white men, and then with people of color. Now again, most UUs aren't actively, they're saying they're uncomfortable with those identities or most identities, but there are a few that come up consistently in my experience of looking at search packets with this survey. A few people and a few identities. In the surveys I've seen, and it's only a few people, it's like 3 to 5 people out of 100 who say in the survey that they would be uncomfortable with a minister who comes from wealth, as I mentioned earlier, who is transgender, who is fat, or who has struggled with mental illness or addiction. So I don't want to dwell on this too much. The main point of this sermon is to give you a simple recipe for practicing being welcoming, to widen your circle by making yourself small, by focusing on learning about the other person, by focusing more on learning who they are than telling them who you are, and by remaining curious about ideas and ways of being that you don't like or even judge as inferior. That's the simple recipe I want to give you for practicing being welcoming. But we say that we are a welcoming and inclusive spiritual home, and being truly inclusive is another story. That is much, much harder work. That involves a deeper look at our community and the biases we hold, and then working to counter those biases. Biases which are baked into the brain from a very young age. Biases that aren't really going away, but which we can counter, which we can choose to not give into. Like we can choose to ask why a person likes Mozart or why they like the Wu-Tang Clan. It's okay to have biases. They persist because they're in the water, the cultural water. I learned recently that you can map communities with higher rates of implicit bias without even researching their implicit bias. Now, we only know that because we have mapped counties for implicit bias, but researcher Keith Payne has compared a map Abraham Lincoln had made in the 1860s. A map showing county by county the proportion of enslaved to free people in every county in the southern states. He did this as a military strategy, based on the idea that the higher proportion of enslaved people, the harder the enslavers would fight to keep slavery. So researcher Keith Payne compared this map with a map showing rates of implicit racial bias county by county and found a high degree of correlation. The maps looked strikingly similar. So think about that. That suggests, doesn't prove, but it suggests that these communities have remained racist or more racist than other counties in the South. Counties that in 1860, just the only difference was in 1860, they had a lower density of enslaved people. And even though it's not the same people today, it's not even the descendants of the same people. Americans are mobile. We move around all the time. But we are shaped by the culture around us. Implicit bias isn't really about us as individuals. It's a reflection within us of the community that surrounds and shapes us. And by the way, implicit bias does a terrible job of determining whether individuals will act in biased ways. There's all kinds of variables. You might be having a bad day and not be biased and still be discriminatory or make bad decisions. You might be having a really fabulous day. We don't know exactly why. It's not good for predicting individual behavior. But what it is good at predicting is communal behavior. So you look at those same counties, and if there's a high degree of an average, a high average of implicit bias on race, then there's a higher incidence of police shootings of unarmed Black people in that community, in that county, in that region. So what implicit bias is telling us is about who we are as a community. So if we're going to do the harder work of unpacking our biases, our preference for white women minister over white male minister over a minister of color, for example, or our even stronger bias towards fat people, rich people, transgender people, and people struggling with addiction or mental illness. Those are the same, by the way. Addiction is a mental health issue. If we're going to do that harder work, we need to work at the community level to transform our congregational culture and the surrounding culture. That's how we'll be able to transform our own minds. And in response to our mission statement, our board, one of the task forces that will be commissioned this year, there's 3, I think. One of them is a task force to look at membership growth and how we can be even more welcoming and inclusive. So we are going to do this deeper work so that this can truly be a welcoming and inclusive spiritual home for everyone. Now, I know this is, like, y'all are good at welcoming people. Don't hear me wrong, right? This is about the deeper work. This is about growing in spirit, even acknowledging that we're already pretty good at caring, better than pretty good at caring in community in this congregation. Okay. So, I just want to point out that when I got to this part in the sermon, I was already up to 2,000 words. So but there's so much to say on this topic. So I'm going to try to go quickly through my last points. I want us to also think about, why are we called to be welcoming? Why did people come here, and why do they stay or not stay? People didn't just come, just because, like on a whim. Church is just not that popular these days. It just isn't. People come because they have a need. Think for a moment. Remember when you first came. You had a need. People come searching for meaning. People come because they're lonely and they long for community. People come because they are heartbroken. And we continue to have needs. We continue to be lonely. We continue to search for meaning. We continue to face heartbreak. That's why the welcoming is never ending. That's why I also chose the slightly awkward never-ending welcoming instead of never-ending welcome, to emphasize that welcoming is a verb. Well, technically an adverb. Is that right? Adverb? Adjective? I wanted to emphasize the verb aspect of it, the practice of it, that we need to practice welcoming. Also, I want us to think about, as we talked about in our Time for All Ages, what we have to offer. It's valuable. It's needed. I know we don't want to proselytize. I know we don't need people to become Unitarian Universalists. The thing is, people need us and this faith. So get your t-shirts, right? Show up at the Burke Festival.
How much of the stage cost stays with the church?
I don't know. Tell your friends. Tell your friends about Unitarian Universalism. Use those 6 words that make it easy. Use our 3-phrase care and community, grow in spirit, act for justice. Put it into your own words. Change spirit to wisdom. That's okay. Let people know. And the last thing I want to emphasize, at least in this part of the sermon, is who is called to welcome? Who's going to grow our membership? It isn't me. Studies show that it's you. Studies show that people need to see in their first visit the possibility of making a friend. Not the actual development, but the possibility. Studies show that if they're not welcomed in the first, I think it's 5 to 10 minutes, they're probably not coming back. And if after 3 times, they haven't found that opportunity for friendship, they're definitely not coming back. So you have said, as a congregation, when we were doing the contract to call process, that you want to grow your membership. So it's going to take all of us to do that. So briefly, just a brief mention of what is and isn't welcoming. You all have probably heard the term microaggressions. I'm not going to go deep into that. You know, a couple examples. Don't say to a black person, "You are so articulate," especially with surprise in your voice. We laugh because it's so ridiculous, and yet it happens. It even happens in UU congregations. Don't say to an Asian American, "Your English is so good." Don't say to anybody of color, "Where are you from?" And then when they tell you Chicago, say, "No, where are you from? Really?" Now there's a simple, we could go, and we probably should and will go into microaggressions, not necessarily from the pulpit, in more detail. But I also want to give you just like a really simple shorthand. Don't accentuate people's differences. People often will talk about the fact that I have an Amish beard or a beard like Abraham Lincoln. And it's annoying because I'm a whole person who just happens to like to wear my facial hair like this, right? Like that is not crucial to who I am. I want you to want to know me, right? We all want people to know us. So there's a natural tendency, right? And I'm not saying that I haven't done it. You will mess up and make mistakes. I have literally been introducing a new member from a Mormon background to another member because they have an actual connection of something they're both interested in. And then I threw in, "Oh, and we have other people here who've been Mormons in the past and are now UUs." That person was not asking for that. Right? It's a different thing if she were to say, "I'm struggling with the pain of my Mormon background." But even in that situation, then you want someone else who's struggling with their religious background, which might not be the people in the congregation who come from a Mormon background. I'm going to give one more example because I want to promote the poetry group. I would expect that Ana Maria Viveros Long probably loves the Chilean poet Pablo Neruda. Because we all love the Chilean poet Pablo Neruda. He's one of the most popular poets in the world. But don't go up to Ana Maria because she's Chilean American, and for that reason, talk to her about how much she probably loves Pablo Neruda. It'd be better, here's the promotion piece, it'd be better right now to ask Ana Maria or anybody in the poetry group which Barrett Browning they love more, whether they're on Team Robert or Team Elizabeth. Team Elizabeth right here, by the way. Let's just do it. It's Team Elizabeth. I mean, those sonnets, those love sonnets. I mean, come on. Okay, Team Robert. We got some Team Roberts? Okay. Some of y'all are like, "I haven't read these people since high school." I don't know. All right. Yes, yes, the plug, sorry, thanks for the assist there, Connie. As I said, I was partly putting this in to promote the poetry group, which is meeting in the next week and looking at the Barrett Brownings, okay? So, never-ending welcoming, it's a practice. You're gonna mess up, but it's a practice that we're called to do in this congregation with newcomers, with longtime members, with everybody, and also in our own lives. That might even be the hardest part, right? That person you've been married to for 13 or 27 or 51 years. What about staying open and fresh in welcoming them? It's not easy. It's going to take awareness. It's going to take care. It would even benefit from some study, but that's what we're called to do. We're called to that practice of welcoming. And I know that this congregation is up for it. I know that you are welcoming and inclusive. I know you're so welcoming and inclusive in your desire that it's hard to hear about any way that we might not be welcoming or inclusive, because we desperately want. We're committed to that as a value. But let's not let our commitment to that and our desire for it get in the way of our seeing where we're not doing it, so that we can do it fully. All right, may we be among those who make it so. Amen, amen, amen.